How to read wars. So the genocidal. Tigray war is the biggest war of the decade. From thebaffler.com. Gaza and Ukraine are not the deadliest of our current wars. The deadliest one gets far less attention. The hard truth is that not all deaths matter equally. Some don't matter at all. Some mass deaths are in fact welcomed. Famine is the most effective and ancient form of warfare, killing far more than combat. Does the young decade of the 2020s has already seen major wars in the Horn of Africa, Armenia, Ukraine, Palestine, Yemen, and Myanmar, as well as sputtering irregular wars across Africa's Sahel. What can you learn by looking at these recent wars? The wrong lessons usually if you follow the dominant news sources. That coverage almost always advances the our team versus the other team perspective. There are lessons to be learned from observing modern warfare, but you have to look for patterns, not sentiment, not who claims the moral high ground, not even who has the most advanced military. The deadliest wars. But Gaza and Ukraine are not the deadliest of our current wars. The deadliest one gets far less attention. The hard truth here is that not all deaths matter equally. Some don't matter at all. Some mass deaths are in fact welcomed, though those who welcome them have usually learned to be discreet since they cheered for famines across the British Empire, from Ireland to India. Israel is setting new standards for genocidal rhetoric at the moment. In October, Knesset member Tali Gottlieb said, "Without hunger and thirst among the Gazan population, we will not be able to recruit collaborators, we will not be able to recruit intelligence, we will not be able to bribe people with food, drink, and medicine in order to obtain intelligence." Famine is the most effective and ancient form of warfare, killing far more than combat does. When armies with Western support can't defeat insurgent movements on the battlefield, they resort to blockades and the famines and epidemics that always follow. This is what happened in the Nigerian Biafran War of 1967-1970, when Biafran troops stopped federal Nigerian forces, who retaliated with a naval blockade that killed up to 2 million Biafrans. The United States and UK were, of course, solidly behind the Nigerian regime. Famine was the weapon again in the Saudi versus Houthi war of the past decade. The Houthi forces defeated their domestic rivals, which irked the Saudi royals. Like the Russian army in Ukraine, the Saudi military told their bosses that with their new weapons they could destroy the Houthis, who had nothing more than AKs, mortars, a few captured armored vehicles, and homemade surface-to-surface rockets. It did not go well. What the Houthis had, and the Saudis did not, was dedicated infantry. Most Saudi infantry joins for the paycheck. The Houthi militia fight for their community's survival, and because it's the life they know. What the Saudis and their US and UK backers did have was money, mercenaries, and an air force.
Human Rights Watch claims Saudi authorities have killed hundreds of Ethiopian migrants crossing the border from Yemen.
A deeply disturbing report released on Monday by Human Rights Watch alleges that Saudi border guards killed at least hundreds of Ethiopian migrants and asylum seekers attempting to cross the border from Yemen into Saudi Arabia between March of 2022 and June of this year. Now, Human Rights Watch says that if these killings are committed as part of an intentional Saudi government policy to murder migrants, it could amount to a crime against humanity.
We love Saudi Arabia.
We love you more.
We love Saudi Arabia. The king is my friend, the crown prince is my friend, there's now the prime minister, crown prince, and everything else. And he deserves to be, but they're great friends of mine and they're great people. And it's an honor to have so many Saudis. I just spoke to Yasser and I said, you know, we have so many Saudis today. It's so nice to see that. They love us and we love them.
They used all of these to blockade northwestern Yemen very effectively. Yemeni children died in huge numbers. No one in the Western press much cared how many. The Saudi regime's killing of Jamal Khashoggi, a Washington Post columnist, was much more important to mainstream media than the deaths of at least 377,000 Yemenis, most of them from disease and starvation. Who will remember the dead kids of Yemen in a few years? There are massacres that do get remembered, like the Holocaust itself, but that usually happens when a powerful state has reason to invoke those dead. So the fact that the Tigray War, the biggest war of the decade, doesn't get as much attention as much smaller wars isn't really such an anomaly. UK-based Horn of Africa analyst Abdurrahman Syed has estimated that between 700,000 and 800,000 people died in the first 2 years of this decade. As the Tigray People's Liberation Front, TPLF fought against the armies of Ethiopia and Eritrea, a small highland province in the north of Ethiopia sitting on the southern border of Eritrea. Tigray has played an outsized role in Ethiopian power struggles. The TPLF evolved from a Tigrayan student movement in Addis Ababa in the 1970s. While other student-based guerrilla groups fought in the streets against the Derg, the Ethiopian General Socialist Junta, at the time, the TPLF studied Mao as well as Lenin, leaving the city to return to the mountains of Tigray to fight a rural guerrilla war. This move paid off. The purely Leninist groups were wiped out by the Darg's cops in the streets of Addis, while the TPLF grew stronger in the villages of Tigray. This is an important lesson for leftists planning an insurrection. If you're contemplating an insurgency in an impoverished rural area, Maoism has a pretty good track record. The TPLF grew in the isolated villages of Tigray until it was the big player in a coalition of insurgents that got rid of the Derg in 1991. After that victory, Tigray dominated Ethiopia for 2 decades. Since Tigrayans are only 6% of the population, this engendered a lot of resentment. The Amhara, at least 22% of the population, who had been the dominant ethnic group, were outraged. The Oromo, the biggest group in the country, 36%, were tired of being shut out by the Highlanders, whether Tigrayan or Amhara. Tigray had adopted Christianity early and resisted successive waves of Muslim invaders. Tigray shares its Habesha culture, Highland, Orthodox Christian, Semitic language, with the Amhara, just to the south. Habesha peoples have always seen themselves as the true Ethiopians, to the detriment of the Oromo, Afar, and roughly 60 other ethnic groups in the lowlands. By 2018, the Tigrayan elite was vulnerable. Mailes Zenawi, their brilliant leader since his student days in Addis, was dead, and the Tigrayans lost their edge without him. Abiy Ahmed, a young technocrat from a mixed Christian-Muslim background with Oromo ancestry, though some claimed he was part Amhara, seemed to offer a new face that would look good to the Oromo youth and to the West. He became Prime Minister of Ethiopia in 2018. Famine is the most effective and ancient form of warfare, killing far more than combat does. Abiy worked fast, flying to Eritrea to cut a deal with Isaias Afwerki, the Eritrean dictator, a grim survivor who'd betrayed and outlived many a sharper rival than Abiy. Isaias allowed himself to be talked into a deal with Abiy to end the Eritrea-Ethiopia border war, and the world cheered, giving Abiy a Nobel Peace Prize in 2019. Those well-meaning Scandinavians were a little premature. In a series of secret meetings, Isaias and Abiy appeared to have agreed to a joint Ethiopia-Eritrea pincer attack on Tigray. That's another good lesson in war watching. When a miraculous good news story comes out of nowhere, watch and wait, because it'll turn out to be a mirage. Countries don't make peace until they've run out of the energy and birth rate to make wars. The pincer attack on Tigray kicked off in November 2020, while the Tigrayans planned to ambush the Ethiopian convoys in Tigray's landscape of hills and gullies. They hadn't planned for drone warfare. The United Arab Emirates supplied Chinese Wing-Lung drones to both Ethiopia and Eritrea. Drones wiped out TPLF outposts just as the Turkish and Israeli-made drones had done in Nagorno-Karabakh, disrupting defensive lines and allowing Ethiopian and Eritrean armor to easily roll into Tigray. The Ethiopian government also shut down all internet and phone communication in Tigray. This disrupted TPLF communications. It also made recording atrocities impossible. For months, there was no news out of Tigray except what the Ethiopian government chose to tell. The Eritrean government had been out of communication with the rest of the world even before the war. In the vacuum of reliable information, a polemicist's war exploded on X, Facebook, and WhatsApp, most often in English. Ethiopian nationalists vilified Tigrayans. Tigrayans posted desperate pleas for help, and outside of the expatriate audiences, no one in the cities of the West paid much attention. Few Western news agencies seemed to try very hard to get direct footage from Tigray, and that made the blackout effective. Still, one could be certain that terrible things were happening in Tigray. Prone to famine, with food supplies cut off from Ethiopia to the south and Eritrea to the north. This landlocked, dry, high-altitude region was left to its own resources, which are scanty at the best of times. Human rights groups with sources in Tigray warned about massacres committed by the Eritrean Defense Forces, EDF. Rape was common among both Eritrean and Ethiopian troops. There were apparently a great many executions of suspicious-looking men of military age in villages entered by the EDF or Ethiopian National Defense Forces. With nowhere else to go, Tigrayans fled west to Sudan. It looked like Tigray was doomed to wallow in misery for decades. And then, on June 29th, 2021, came one of the most shocking headlines of the decade. Tigray's former rulers back in Mekelle. Out of nowhere, the TPLF marched into Mekelle, the capital of Tigray, leading thousands of POWs from the Ethiopian army. Victory was the last thing anyone expected to emerge from the news blackout, but there it was, a stunning triumph against the bigger, better-armed power in a world where those are few and far between. And, in passing, another vindication of Maoist doctrine in rural guerrilla war, even given the adversary's superior technology. Drones had earlier devastated the TPLF's prepared hilltop positions in the first part of the war, but seemed to have little impact against smaller, quicker ambushes. In the long run, however, providence usually is on the side of the bigger battalions. The TPLF, now fighting as the Tigray Defense Force, TDF, won many battles, and even moved south to threaten Addis Ababa in alliance with the Oromo Liberation Army. The big money and foreign backers didn't want to see the Ethiopian state dismembered. The UAE sent more drones, decimating the TDF columns moving south on the A2 highway. The Oromo didn't have much combat power, and their alliance was a long-term threat to the central government, not an immediate military problem. The TDF counteroffensive fizzled out, pulling back to Tigray proper. The big war between Tigray and the combined forces of Eritrea and Ethiopia officially ended with a ceasefire November 2022. But another feature of contemporary wars is that they don't have clear starting and ending points. Both Eritrean and Ethiopian forces continue to harass the Tigrayan population. The Ethiopian government, having failed to defeat Tigray, decided to starve it out, and the international community, such as it is, largely went along with that program. In 2023, for example, the United States Agency for International Development and the UN's World Food Programme cut food aid to Tigray for several months.
The United States Agency for International Development, USAID, alongside the UN's World Food Programme, WFP, have suspended all food assistance to the northern Ethiopian region of Tigray over theft of humanitarian supplies. USAID Administrator Samantha Power said Wednesday that the agency uncovered that food aid intended for the people of Tigray suffering under famine-like conditions was being diverted and sold on the local market. After discovering food was missing, the agency said it alerted its Inspector General, who launched an investigation. Power had said on April 26 that the food theft appeared to involve collusion between parties of both sides of the conflict.
This week, the Biden administration is sending its most senior official yet to Addis Ababa, the capital of Ethiopia. USAID Director Samantha Power is putting pressure on the Ethiopian government and its Nobel Peace Prize winning Prime Minister to alleviate a humanitarian crisis in the country's Tigray region.
This is highly disturbing, and this whole digital ID thing seems to me to be targeting, again, vulnerable populations. If you look at initiatives like ID 2020, for example, which is very much tied up with Bill Gates, they piloted a lot of their stuff overtly with a charity that's been accused of child abuse and child sexual assault, was used to pilot a digital ID program for stateless people in Southeast Asia. And it was framed as voluntary, but if these stateless people wanted to access food or medical care through this charity, they had to participate in this digital ID program and surrender their biometric information and be part of this experiment. And this same type of effort is what Cardano and these guys, Ben Gertzel, have been behind in Ethiopia, because it's all about, they say it pretty openly, it's about tying a digital ID to a digital wallet and creating basically a surveillance apparatus where these children's performances in schools and what they do in their lives is tracked, and that data is saved, and they're using it to feed artificial intelligence algorithms, most likely without their consent. Because if this is required at all Ethiopian schools, children and their parents have to choose between their children getting an education or being part of this program and having their data given to these obviously predatory people. So again, I find this incredibly disturbing. I think more people should know about it, because we're seeing this whole system being tested on vulnerable populations, but at the end of the day, the intention is to have all children and all people on this kind of system, on this digital ID surveillance grid.